When police finally captured the Yorkshire Ripper, many stood staring at him through the one-way glass in disbelief. Slightly stocky and of average height, he looked nothing like the monster they had so feverishly been hunting over a period of 4 years, in an investigation that would be the most expensive Britain, up to that point, had ever had. 2 tiny facts that will put the magnitude of the investigation into focus is that, for instance, 250,000 people would be interviewed and 16 million pieces of mail would be scrutinized. If they expected an unnatural beast, the result was disappointing to say the least. Peter Sutcliffe was just an ordinary guy, slightly good-looking with a wife, a mortgage and an average suburban life, working as a truck driver. He could be your neighbor or your co-worker. But as the evidence slowly falls into place and the puzzle pieces form a picture, there is no doubt that they have the Yorkshire Ripper in custody. Flanked by 5 major cities, each with their own identity, Yorkshire County would be the place where Peter Sutcliffe would commit a series of horrific crimes. Born outside Bradford on the 2nd of June, 1946, he was one of 6 siblings. He was born prematurely and was described as a weak, meek and underdeveloped child. His father was an alcoholic and beat his mother on the regular in front of the children. Peter absolutely adored her and worshipped the ground she walked on. He had a couple of run-ins with authorities, including stealing a car when he was 18 and when he was 23, he was arrested when, after being questioned about idling in a known area for illicit activities with his lights off, he sped away, and after being caught during a short pursuit, a hammer was found in his car. He was also arrested when he stole car tires from his employer when he was 29, but none of these crimes would allude to the devastation he would later cause. According to Peter, his sexual sadistic nature was triggered when the first known victim Wilma McCann mocked him when he did not know how to solicit sex from a prostitute, and then again when he could not get an erection. She had left her home and children on the 25th of October, 1976 to earn some money and found herself in a car in an abandoned stretch near the Prince Philip football field one evening, when Peter beat her skull in, and then cut her throat. She was found the following morning by a milkman and his brother. Her pants had been pulled down, her jacket and blouse ripped, and her bra pulled up, and she was still clutching her handbag. She had obviously been murdered where she was found, and after she had been struck twice, she had been stabbed. The killer had masturbated over her body, but apart from the semen stain, very little was available as far as clues were concerned. Wilma was 28 years old and his first confirmed kill. Eight weeks and 5 days later, 48-year-old Emily Jackson would be murdered by Peter as her husband sat drinking in a pub waiting for her. He was well aware that she did sex work, and after not finding her outside, assumed she had picked up a customer. His signature of pulling down clothing and masturbating over the body was prevalent, but this time the attack was much more brutal. Despite an unsympathetic attitude toward sex workers, officers started their search into identifying the weapon used in bludgeoning of her skull as well as the stab wounds they found on her. A new clue was also the imprint of a boot found near her body. Unfortunately, the investigation was not seen as that important, since the victim was a sex worker, and it would take more violence before police would ramp up their efforts to catch the killer. Marcella Clarkson was attacked on the 9th of May. Sutcliffe forced her into his car and attacked her with a blunt object. The woman, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, would survive the blows but would lose her baby. She would later recall how he whispered that he should not tell the police. He then masturbated over her and then dropped a £5 note on her. She had 8 different skull lacerations. She would describe her attacker as a man of average height with dark hair and a beard. The body of Irene Richardson was found in a park after she left her home on the 5th of February, 1977 to visit a friend. Her clothes were in the disarray that officers had come to recognize, and she was first beaten over the head with a hammer and then stabbed with what seems to be a very sharp knife. Police executed a fingertip search of the park, but this yielded nothing new. Registration numbers were being taken down of suspicious vehicles and door-to-door inquiries were being made, but police had the added burden that sex workers did not trust the police. The last time anyone saw Patricia Atkinson on the 23rd of April, 1977 was when she was ejected out of the Carlisle Hotel, after trying to perform a strip show in a drunken stupor. The 32-year-old woman was beaten, stabbed, and her clothes once again were in disarray. This time a clear boot print was visible in blood on her bed sheets. The attack had occurred as she entered the room. Peter then dragged her body onto the bed to continue his assault. Panic was setting in, and by now the crimes had made national headlines. His attack on 16-year-old Jane MacDonald was out of character, since the cheerful and sweet girl was not a sex worker. She made the fatal mistake of returning home on the 26th of June, 1977, after missing the last bus home. Her house happened to be only meters away from where Wilma McCann's body was found, where it was covered in rubbish lying near a playground. She had been stabbed many times and received at least 3 blows to the head. This attack seemed to intensify the search for the monster. The investigation was accumulating a tremendous amount of paperwork and had officers working 13 hours a day to solve the crimes. Some even sleeping at the station, convinced the Yorkshire Ripper will strike again. Her innocence shifted perceptions of the Yorkshire Ripper, as he had become known. He suddenly became everyone's public enemy number one. All Maureen Long, aged 42, could tell officers when she woke up in the hospital was that she had attended a dance hall, and her last memory was of her going into the cloakroom. Her cries for help would lead to her being found in an abandoned structure, and she joked that the only reason she did not die of hypothermia was the amount of beer she drank. She would spend 9 weeks in hospital recovering from her injuries. In an odd way to get sex workers off the streets, police started arresting them on sight, causing even more distrust and uncooperating potential witnesses. On 1 October, 20-year-old Joan Jordan was murdered in Manchester, as the Ripper expanded his reign of terror. She was found naked 9 days later. Her handbag was found further away with a brand new £5 note in it. It would later emerge that Peter had returned to the scene to look for that note, since he knew it would somehow be linked to him. As if the multiple blows to her skull and stab wounds were not enough, he tried to saw off her head, but was unsuccessful. He did this after returning to the body to find the £5 note he had given her, but she was crafty enough to hide this crucial piece of evidence in a secret compartment in her handbag. It would be survivor Marilyn Moore who would give investigators later the best description of her attacker. She was found behind an abundant factory. A man calling himself David had solicited sex from her, and the last she remembered was getting into the back of his car on the 14th of December, 1977, and being bashed over the head. Something must have spooked him because he abandoned the attack and took off. Like many other victims, she would receive immediate neurosurgery. She would describe her attacker as having a Jason King mustache, referring to a fictional character of the time. She described him as a good-looking man with a tan and curly hair who was soft-spoken. Along with Maureen Long, she would undergo hypnosis and become the best witness for the prosecution after Peter's capture. "18-year-old twin sisters, Helen and Rita Ritka, were working near a public toilet block on the 31st of January, 1978, when they were both picked up in 2 separate vehicles and returned in 2 separate vehicles. The drop-offs had no more than a 5-minute difference, but when Rita returned to the toilet block, her sister was gone. She returned to the flat they shared, but Helen was nowhere in sight. 2 days later she reported her sister missing. She would be found 80 meters away from the toilet block, covered with an asbestos sheet, with 6 lacerations to her skull and multiple stab wounds. The perpetrator had returned to the scene of the crime, and it would be the first time he had tried to conceal his crime. A £10,000 reward was offered, which would eventually be increased to £20,000. The last time Yvonne Pearson was seen alive was when she left the Flying Dutchman pub on the 21st of January, 1978, stating that she was off to make some money, after having a couple of drinks. Her body was found 2 months later when someone observed an arm sticking out of an abandoned sofa. A newspaper with the date the 21st of February was found under her hand and a ball of coarse horsehair was found in her mouth. Her skull was completely demolished. On the 16th of May, 1978, Vera Millard left for the shops and then to go to the hospital, because she had been complaining about problems with her stomach. Her body was found the following day on the hospital grounds, and despite the property being private, it was notorious for being frequented by sex workers and their clients. Peter went dormant for a while, but on the 9th of April, 1979, he attacked Josephine Whittaker after the 19-year-old left her home after an argument with her mother. She spent some time at her grandparents' house, where they tried to convince her to stay for the night. But she refused, and it was on her way back from there that the attack took place, less than a mile from their home. Once again, her clothing had been tampered with and the body had clearly been moved. Her body was found the next morning, and her family would unfortunately find out when her brother passed the crime scene and recognized her shoes. Her skull had been fractured by several blows, and this time a new unidentified weapon had been used to stab her. Once again, the same Wellington boot print was found on the scene, and this time, Peter had bitten his victim, and a clear mark was visible. The search for the new weapon was intensified and cops searched everywhere from factories to slaughterhouses, looking for the instrument of death with its distinctive shape. What complicated the investigation even more was the arrival of 2 letters and a cassette tape that had supposedly been sent by the Yorkshire Ripper. When top profiler Robert Dressler came to assist and from the FBI finally told the lead investigators that the letters and tape were a hoax, hundreds of man-hours had already been wasted in trying to identify the mail from Sunderland. The sender was eventually identified as John Humble, and he would spend 8 years in prison for this cruel prank that would cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds in billboards and other advertising mediums. It was a debacle that would be just one more misstep in the investigation that could have ended much, much earlier. Apart from completely ignoring the best composite of Peter they could have ever hoped for, his name had been indexed wrongly and he would eventually during the course of the investigation be interviewed a staggering 9 times. Scotland Yard would eventually make recommendations and streamline the investigation by reducing the massive amount of paperwork that was consuming so much valuable time. "20-year-old Barbara Leach decided that, despite the rain, she would walk home from her local pub on the 1st of September, 1979. She would be reported missing the following day, and 2 days later, her body would be found under a carpet and some loose rocks. By now the signature head wounds were recognizable, but this time they had a greasy substance on them. Detective Ridgway could not shake the feeling that their culprit could be identified through the £5 note. In an unprecedented move, he convinced the bank manager to check the exact amount of banknotes, and the note was identified as having belonged to one of 6,000 people who were paid from this specific batch. Peter Sutcliffe was one of those people. By the time he was arrested, that number had been narrowed down to 241, but not before the Yorkshire Ripper caused more death and devastation. After more attacks during which victims survived, 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill would be viciously attacked. Peter did not care anymore who his victim were, and the timid Sunday school teacher was described as a genuinely good and gentle person. Her body would be found on the 17th of November, 1980, north of Leeds. Her head had been bashed in and her stab wounds seemed to have been made by a chisel. Despite the countless man-hours put into the investigation, police seemed to be no closer to finding the serial killer. Even then, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher put pressure on the Home Secretary to assist in the finding of the murderer. Protest marches reflecting the displeased nature of the public with regards to the investigation became a regular event. The pressure was so intense that Detective Oldfield, who had been one of the lead investigators, had a heart attack and needed to remove himself from the investigation. 4 of the top investigators were chosen to lead the investigation further, and the very first thing they did was to dispel the hoax letters and tape. They revisited crime scenes, and every viable lead was once again scrutinized. By carefully studying the map marking where each attack took place and where the bodies were found, they identified the center of gravity, aka his home base, as Bradford. This matched the statements that the attacker had an accent from this specific area. It would, however, be the stopping of a suspicious vehicle that would give investors their final break. On the evening of the 2nd of January, 1981, officers noticed a suspicious-looking Ford Escort in the driveway of an abandoned steelworks factory. They knew the man, who called himself John Williams, could only be there for one reason. He was arrested for suspicion of theft, since the number plates did not match his vehicle and would also be identified as Peter Sutcliffe. It's important to note that when Peter was arrested in April 1980 and released on bail, he would kill his last 2 victims. Fortunately, this time around, police were acutely aware of the similarities between the identikit and the man in front of them. In a bizarre twist, when he was searched, he was found to be wearing an inverted sweater that would effectively expose his genitals. This just added to the mounting circumstantial evidence, and soon Sonia, Peter's wife's claims that her husband had been with her on the specific dates that certain attacks took place, was disproved and rubbished. The only remorse he would show after confessing was murdering Jane MacDonald, and his only request was that he himself would tell his wife the truth, that he indeed was the Yorkshire Ripper. He was charged with 13 murders and 7 assaults and tried very hard for the insanity plea, but after 3 psychiatrists could not agree, he was deemed fit to stand for trial. He desperately tried to claim that the voice of God had spoken to him when he was a grave digger and working in the cemetery, but he would be found guilty in the Old Bailey and sentenced to 20 life sentences in Parkhurst prison. To say his 2-month stay in prison was unpleasant is an understatement. He was attacked and beaten every day, and even placing him in isolation could not prevent him from being abused. Whether he was faking his unhinged psyche or whether the diagnoses by doctors of possible paranoid schizophrenia was actually true, we do not know, but he made claims such as that he met the Queen in a bar. Peter would secretively usher away in the middle of the night on the 27th of March, 1984 from Parkhurst to Broadmoor. He would continue to be attacked during his stay at the institution, but not to the extent of the beatings he took in Parkhurst. For the first 9 years he refused treatment. Shockingly, Peter would have the biggest mailbag of all the patients at the institution. Women from far and wide would write, either to elicit letters to be sold later or because the way some find Ted Bundy handsome, they found Peter Sutcliffe attractive and alluring. He focused most of his time, even to his old age, writing feverishly in a juvenile fashion to his admirers. His allowed 4 visitors a week would consist of young women holding his hand and stroking his arm. Some would even threaten action by their solicitors when staff told them they could not bring their children on visits for obvious reasons. In a recorded phone call with his brother Carl, a 70-year-old Peter could be heard speaking about the latest young admirer that planned to visit him, indicating that this pervert had not changed one bit, and the courts would agree, ruling in August 2016 that he should serve the remainder of his sentence in Franklin Prison. It's at times like these that I feel a huge sadness for the silent victims of these criminals, specifically, their own family members. During his last conversation with his brother, Carl would let the supportive family member role slip for a moment and tell Peter he wishes he had been given the death sentence. Considering the harassment and torment anyone even slightly related to this pervert had to suffer, I don't blame him for wishing his brother died long ago. He would eventually die there on the 11th of February, 2020, after refusing to be treated for COVID-19. Thank you for watching my Shades of Evil video blog, Episode 9, The Yorkshire Ripper. Please join me here on my YouTube channel for further true crime episodes. Please like, share and subscribe. If you have already, then thank you.